Last page, paragraph 21. Is that to say that suffering is indispensable to the discovery of meaning? Does that mean you have to suffer to find meaning? In no way. I only insist that meaning is available. And this is one of the most important points of the whole text. I only insist that meaning is available in spite of suffering, provided that the suffering is unavoidable. So it's a bit different from Nietzsche, who says, embrace suffering, go find suffering, and overcome it, and you'll find meaning in that. And he thinks that that's how you find meaning, because he's approaching humans from an almost biological standpoint, survival of the fittest. So how do you find meaning? Well, by proving yourself to be the most fit, by overcoming as much suffering as you possibly can. Notice that Frankl here is saying suffering is unavoidable. If suffering is unavoidable, then you overcome it. If you can avoid it, well, it just makes sense to avoid it. And that's, of course, a very different approach from the idea of go find suffering and beat it out. He's saying, yeah, try to avoid it. If it's avoidable, the meaningful thing to do is to remove its cause. For unnecessary suffering is masochistic rather than heroic. Nietzsche would kick his ass for saying that. But the idea is that masochistic means that you enjoy pain. I'll let you discover that what I mean by that. But the idea is that giving yourself over to suffering just for the sake of suffering, he says, that's not heroic. That's just masochistic. That's just beating yourself for no reason. If, on the other hand, one cannot change a situation that causes his suffering, he can still choose his attitude. It's a very stoic approach. We're going to look at Stoicism in about 2 weeks. So, if you can change your circumstances, what should you do? Change your circumstances. But sometimes you can't change your circumstances. In those cases, overcoming suffering gives you meaning. But in those circumstances. Long, who we talked about earlier, Long had not chosen to break his neck, but he did decide to not let himself be broken by what happened to him. And that was something that Jerry Long had said. I broke my neck, but that didn't break me. My neck didn't break me. In turning to the second aspect of the tragic triad, namely guilt, I would like to depart from a theological concept that has always been fascinating to me, which refers to the mysterium iniquitatis, meaning, as I see it, that a crime in the final analysis remains inexplicable insomuch as it cannot be fully traced back to a biological, psychological, and or sociological factors. Totally explaining one's crime would be tantamount to explaining away his or her guilt and to seeing in him or her not a free, responsible individual, being, but a machine to be repaired. So this is a significant point, especially in 2020 today. Essentially what he's getting at here is that we tend to look at crime and criminals and say, well, why do people commit crimes? It's their upbringing, it's their genetics, it's their biology. When we actually take a person and reduce them to that, we're no longer looking at them as a person. We're looking at them as a machine that has to be repaired. Because after all, if the reason that you commit a crime, or do anything, anything immoral, we might say, why did you do it? It's your genetics, it's because of how you were brought up, it's because of society, sociological factors. Well, here's a question, how do you fix that? Isn't that part of the problem that we have today? That we're more fascinated with trying to fix society, in which case while we're doing it, we're making things way worse, which all of our indicators show. Every objective measure shows that we're making things worse. The more we try to tinker, the more we're making it worse. Because once you realize, well, it's not my fault, it's society's fault, so what do? Well, we have to fix society. Once we fix society, then I'll be fixed. But understand what we're saying. A whole bunch of us, with all of our neuroses, all of our damage, all of our problems, all of our psychological shortcomings, somehow we're now capable and equipped to fix society so that we can then be fixed. It's a complete contradiction from the beginning. If you're so damaged because of society, that means you're too damaged to fix society. Well, because I might know what I need. If you're damaged, you don't know what you need. Because if you knew what you need, you'd be pursuing it despite being in a society that you think is damaging you. But also what that means, therefore, is that all of your behavior, or at least a significant portion of your behavior, probably just the negative stuff that we'll give credit to society for, but if society is responsible for that, then how do you become a better person? Well, you can't. Because that means that, because if you could have been a better person, you would have been, right? But society has damaged you too much to the point. Well, now you can't become a better person. It eliminates all of your responsibility for the things that you've done, and it also takes away your power to become better. And that's an important point that he hits on paragraphs 23 and 24. The idea is that if all of your bad behavior is from external causes, well, then what that means, therefore, is that all of your good behavior has to come from external causes. It takes away all of your power to become better. If instead you look at someone and go, you stole a car, why? Because society did these things to me. Well, then you can't get better, so therefore why try? But if you take responsibility for it and say, despite the fact that I had a bad upbringing, despite the fact that these things are against me, despite these sociological factors, which can contribute, sure. It's not to say that they don't have any influence at all. But the idea is that those are things that, going back to paragraph 21, you can't avoid. That's the suffering you can't avoid. Once you can avoid those things, or once you can fix those things yourself, well, then you can fix yourself. Which, if you remember correctly, is how we began this whole fiasco in first semester. An article called Fix Yourself, which says, despite all of these things which play a role, fine, they play a role, what are you going to do? You're going to live your whole life in misery and squalor and complaining because of the things that you can't control? And by the way, if you sit there and think, yeah, who would do that? Dude, society is full of them. Go on YouTube sometimes. You'll find all kinds of people in protests, and you oftentimes find them wearing all black and wearing black masks and running around and smashing the storefronts of Starbucks and things like that, and complaining the whole time about how horrible society is. You can go onto college campuses, the most privileged people to ever walk the face of the earth, likely. We're talking about the 1%. We're talking about like the top 1% of the top 1%. If you're somebody who's fortunate enough to go to university in 2020, you are exceptionally privileged. And then to still say, well, society is horrible in all these ways, and we have to fix it. And it's a person who you won't be able to assume those responsibilities for making yourself better. And so we end up bitter. We end up full of contempt. We end up pissed off. We end up blaming. And you find these kinds of people everywhere. Some of you I know people like this. I know people like that on this campus, whose whole lives seem to be geared towards complaining and being pissed off. And then when there's some kind of a cause that comes around, like the one that we marched around about a couple days ago, then all of a sudden it's like, we have a purpose now. Well, you had a purpose all along. Clean your room. Fix your own life. Get yourself in order. Before you try getting all of society in order, get yourself in order. Because what happens when we try to tinker with society? We screw it up. This is why some of us are so much more comfortable giving advice to other people. And then when we say, like, I'm great at giving advice to people, man, but I can't follow it. Well, then what makes you think you're good at giving advice in the first place? You're good at some type of abstract reason. You're good at theorizing about what might work. But if you really thought it was good advice, you'd be following it yourself. But we don't think it is. It's like Wilde said, the best thing to do with good advice is to pass it along to others. It's never of use to ourselves, right? And so we pass it along to others. We don't follow it ourselves. We don't put ourselves in order. Instead, we just think, well, I'm going to put everything else in order, and then that will fix me. And there's nothing that's harder than fixing yourself. That's a real struggle. It's easy to point fingers at everything else, and then when it doesn't change, we can complain about how it doesn't change, and that's why things are so bad. It's kind of like when people will complain about other people who, this is why the world's so messed up, because people will do these things, and we find ourselves doing the exact same thing. And why do we do it? Well, everybody else is doing it. I might as well. That's why things are messed up. We don't fix ourselves. So, continue to the next paragraph talking about collective guilt, which again we see a lot of today. We have to blame people who are parts of groups. Remember this mantra of 2020. Be yourself, man. You can't judge a book by its cover. Everyone's an individual. But you're also a cross-section of personality traits or character traits. And therefore you must think a certain way if you belong to certain groups. And the idea is that we hold people responsible for things that they never had anything to do with. And again, this is problematic because if you're responsible for the crimes of your ancestors, or if you're responsible for the crimes of your parents, or whatever, then you can't get better. You can't get any better. It's fascinating to me when I listen to people talk about how we should blame people for the things that their ancestors have done and the things that their families have done. And yet in the exact same breath we'll say, but if you're undocumented and you're here, we can't get rid of you. That's not your fault. Your parents brought you here. Well, this is the same thing in all these cases. If we actually have compassion for people and not the things that their parents have done, then why do we have collective guilt? Why is it that we will look at people and say, oh, you're responsible for these things before because your ancestors did them, or your parents did them, or whatever? You know? You can't hold both of those things without a contradiction. The question is going to be, of course, which one do you want to hold? Which one's more precious to you? Now, if you just don't believe in logic and reason or any of these kinds of things, sure, you can hold these two things separate. But again, this is what causes that neuroses of being angry all the time and frustrated all the time, because you can never reach a conclusion this way, because you're constantly fighting out these contradictory principles inside of your mind. So you can never come to a resolution. You can never be happy. You can never be satisfied. Now, if you can solve those sorts of things, then you've got one problem, one task to solve. Assuming, of course, that you fixed yourself first. You know? And so he finally ends up with the opportunities to act properly, the potentialities to fulfill a meaning are affected by the irreversibility of our lives. From this, one may see there's no reason to pity old people. Instead, young people should envy them. It's true that the old have no opportunities, no possibilities in the future, but they have more than that. Instead of possibilities in the future, they have realities in the past. The potentialities they have actualized, the meanings they have fulfilled, the values they have realized, and nothing and nobody can ever remove these assets from the past. It's an important thing for him. The idea is that when you look at old people and we say things like, oh man, it's so sad, they don't have a future. Frankl is saying they have something better than the future. They have a past. They have the things they've actually done. You know, especially at the age that you guys are, it was an easy thing to look into the future and say, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that, I want, or at least we want to be these things. But these things haven't manifested themselves. You know, with old people at least, the things that they have done have been done. What's been done is done. There's no hope for a future. There's achievements of the past, we can say. In other words, they've actually done it. So he concludes, in view of the possibility of finding meaning in suffering, life's meaning is an unconditional one, at least potentially. Again, meaning that even in suffering, we can find meaning. And if you can find meaning in suffering, then you can find meaning anywhere. So therefore, no matter what you're going through, you can find meaning. And meaning is the thing that propels you forward. So even in the worst case scenario. Finally, let us be alert in twofold sense. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of. When you look at the Holocaust, when you look at genocides, we know that people are capable of terrible things. But then since Hiroshima, we know what's at stake. So now we actually have the ability to do those terrible things. You know, so it's like, well, we got to figure something out, because if we don't, we know what that future looks like. So, questions, comments, concerns, complaints?